Hi, everybody. My name is Terry McGovern. I'm the chair of the Population and Family Health Department at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. I also direct a program called Global Health, Justice, and Governance. I am a human rights lawyer and one-time playwright. I couldn't be more thrilled to be on this panel today. It is by far the most interesting thing I'm doing all week. So welcome to Cross-Sectoral Approaches to Ending Gender-Based Violence, Art, Activism, and Research. This event is part of a series, Innovations for Advancing Women's Rights, Beijing Plus 25 and Beyond, organized by Global Health, Justice, and Governance and the Mailman School of Public Health, the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute, and the Feminist and Women's Movement Action Plan, FW MAP. The series explores questions such as what did the Beijing Declaration achieve? How are youth activists maximizing Beijing 25 to advance women's human rights today? How can art be a tool for activism? Through intergenerational dialogue between activists and artists, this series explores innovations in women's rights advocacy. Our event today features an interdisciplinary conversation between researchers, artists, and activists about approaches to ending gender-based violence. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Program on Global Health, Justice, and Governance started a 6-country study to understand GBV service provision and how government policymakers and donors have helped or hindered the response. It's a mess. Let me talk a minute about our speakers. First, I'll introduce Dr. Nicoletta Mabhena. She's a medical doctor and population-based epidemiologist. So she in South Africa. She has worked with us on this study. She has over 20 years of professional experience around treatment, prevention, research, monitoring and evaluation. And we've been very, very lucky to get to work with her. Next, I want to introduce Yolanda Dyantyi, who's a South Africa-based art activist artist. She is currently building her organization, which is in English, Archive Our Stories, Archive Amabali Witu, that has an aim to use various forms of art expression and civic technology to document and archive survivors' stories of gender-based violence and how we have navigated through this violence in search for recovery. We're very, very lucky to have her. Next, I'll introduce Anna MacDonald, who is an international educator and advocate, currently providing lots of work to the United Nations. She led the successful 10-year international campaign for the Arms Trade Treaty, which was adopted in 2013 and spent 5 years working for its implementation. She worked for Oxfam for many years. And last but not least is Etaf Reum, the daughter of Palestinian immigrants. She was born and raised in Brooklyn. She has a Master's of Arts in American and British Literature, as well as an undergraduate degree in philosophy and English composition. She teaches undergraduate courses in North Carolina, where she lives with her 2 children. I really am so thrilled to be here. Thank you all for joining us. I think we're just gonna begin with Nikki. If you could just take maybe 3 minutes to tell us about your research and activism, that would be great. Nikki.
Yes, thanks, Terry. So as Terry mentioned, at the beginning of the pandemic, we did a research and we used qualitative methods to talk to service providers in South Africa. We managed to talk to 20 GBV and SRHR service providers. And as you know, South Africa has been hardest hit in the continent. So we wanted to find out what the impact has been of this lockdown and the pandemic. So we instituted a lockdown in South Africa, and service providers were actually not happy with the response to the pandemic, particularly because only essential services were allowed to continue providing services in the country. And there was a bit of confusion whether GBV was an essential service or not. And it meant that service providers did not know what to do. Communities were shut down. Community-based activities were all ground to a halt. And everything that wasn't COVID-related had to take a back seat. So imagine what this meant for gender-based violence in the country and women who were impacted a lot by violence in their homes. And recognizing now that livelihoods were lost during this time for women, as service providers decided just to change their services and pushed now on food security as a way of empowering women. And also they started having innovative services that could make sure that Ubers and telephonic counseling was used to extract women and to understand what was happening and to push safety for victims. And something else that also really emerged was that initially demand for services reduced. It wasn't because there was no gender-based violence, but because women were scared. They didn't know whether they were allowed to go out during this movement restrictions. And we had some police and the armed forces were on the streets also trying to institute the restrictions. And women were actually worried if they were going to be harmed. And there have been reports of women who have been harmed by the police. And also movement restrictions resulted in no transportation for them. So women were basically stuck at home with the perpetrators. And also, you know, the fear of just contracting the virus itself, it was scary and no one knew what was really happening at that time. So it was a mishmash of things. And as Terry mentioned, it was really, really a mess. And it was also one of the service providers told us that intimate partner violence actually increased during that time. And non-partner, not so much because women were kind of protected because they were not moving around. But in the homes, it was really a mess. And also courts were not processing protection orders for women. They wanted to see blood, as one of the service providers told us. They wanted to just give protection orders for physical violence. And the other thing I just want to highlight, as highlights for this research, is that the country and service providers are worried now because of the pandemic, what is going to happen with donor funding? Because our country is, particularly for GBV responses, is reliant on donor funding. And now the knockoff effect of the economic repercussions to the other countries, particularly bilateral agency funding, has just been highlighted as one thing that everyone is worried about as time moves on. So I think in a nutshell, service providers were really, really not satisfied with the response, although they said that the response was warranted, but it was not properly planned. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you so much. It's really, the research has really uncovered how much all we know is ignored consistently. Yolanda, can you tell us a bit about your art and activism and work? Okay, I'm not sure. We may not have an internet connection here. Okay, Yolanda, you there? Okay, maybe we'll go to Etaf, please. Welcome, you seem very cold and thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us a bit about your work and thank you.
Hello.
Oh wait, Yolanda's back with us. Okay, Yolanda, can you tell us a bit about your work? Sorry there, we lost you for a minute. Hello.
Sorry about that. Yes. Hi, everybody. I am Yolanda Dyantyi. I'm a 23-year-old. I like to identify as a radical feminist activist. And I am based in Johannesburg, South Africa. As Terry has mentioned in the introduction, I am currently trying to grow and build my own organization called Archive Amabali Wethu, which is Archive Our Stories in English. In Xhosa, it's Archive Amabali Wethu. And the reason why I have embarked on this work is really because I'm inspired and moved by the importance of having our stories as young women as survivors really of any forms and all forms of gender-based violence, to have our stories archived and documented with the hopes, obviously to inspire some sort of change in order for our voices really to be at the forefront of the discussion of the work that is happening and what still needs to be done. Yes, I mean, my organization is only 2 years old. It was established in 2019, but I have been an activist. I started out my work, I guess, and my passion was really moved by my own experience of being a survivor. I fell victim to the system in 2015, to be more specific, as a student at Rhodes University. And ever since then, really, I've been moved with trying to hold the system accountable by using my own story, because I believe, our stories are tools, powerful tools that can be used to advocate for change, the change that we desire in our society. So then I'll just keep it to that for now. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. It's very powerful is your work. Can we come back to you, Etaf? Tell us about your work out there in the cold.
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name's Etaf Reum. I wrote my debut novel, A Woman Is No Man, in 2016 and 17. It was published in 2019. And it focused mostly on gender violence and women's stories, Arab American women, Palestinian women whose stories I felt were not being told, women who needed to be empowered and whose voices needed to be heard. And it focused mostly on intergenerational trauma of 3 generations of Palestinian American women. And I know that domestic violence is a universal problem, but I really wanted to use my background and my experiences and experiences of women that I know to highlight a very specific community and a very specific problem. And hopefully that will create conversation in my community around gender violence, and it'll create a safe space for women to share their stories and to start talking about something that is so often silenced and, treated with so much shame. And I feel like that's what this novel has really started, is a conversation about domestic violence and a way to empower our women.
Amazing work. We're going to come back to all of these amazing panelists in a minute. We're just doing a general 3-minute round first. Over to you, Anna. Can you tell us about your work in activism? And
so thank you. I'm talking about an example from the field of armed violence and conflict. So I worked for over a decade with an international coalition of campaigners on the Arms Trade Treaty, which is the first treaty to regulate the global trade in conventional weapons, everything from fighter jets and tanks down to guns and bullets. And one of the things that we managed to achieve, as well as getting this treaty adopted at the UN, was specific language within it on gender-based violence. And it's significant both because the Arms Trade Treaty was the first treaty to specifically have gender-based violence referenced within its operative provisions, so in the main part of the treaty. And secondly, because it makes the link between the availability or proliferation of weapons and the increase in gender-based violence. And the reason that we pushed for that was that so many of our partners who are part of the campaign around the world were raising the problem that the increase in proliferation of weapons, particularly small arms, both increases the incidence of gender-based violence and it increases the lethality of gender-based violence. So it was a long campaign to get this. It started with a great deal of skepticism from many of the governments that we were approaching. And essentially we moved it from when we first introduced the idea of including GBV specifically in the treaty in around 2010, great skepticism, through to it actually being included in 2013. And in the last few years, work to then implement the provision that's in there. So essentially it requires governments to now take into account the risk of gender-based violence, of the use of weapons in gender-based violence or serious violence against women before they authorize an arms transfer. So if there is a high risk of that any weapons that are about to be sold or transfer that's about to be authorized may be used in the perpetuation or facilitation of gender-based violence, then those weapons must not be sold. And it's significant because it's the first time that that explicit link between the availability legality of arms and the incidence of gender-based violence has been enshrined in this way in international law, and that we've managed to secure the majority of the world's governments on side with that now. And in 2019, 5 years after the treaty entered into force, the first action plan was agreed at the International Annual Conference of the treaty for implementation specifically on its gender-based violence provisions. And I'll pause for there.
Great, thank you so much. We'll come back to that amazing work. Etaf, you talked about your book. I believe that, artists and writing and theater and novels can often affect people at a greater, way deeper level than just, policy talk. I wondered if you could talk a bit about the reception of the novel in the community. Do you think the novel kind of spurred change? Your thoughts on that? And thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me. I definitely believe that fiction is the best way to tell the truth in sometimes ways that facts or other research is harder to tell, because fiction can allow people to let their guards down while they're absorbing information and not be so defensive. So in a way, I was telling this story about a specific community, my community, Arab American community, knowing that the information was probably not going to be accepted or received well, because domestic violence is a very taboo subject in many cultures, many traditions all around the world. It's still not talked about without this sense of shame. Communities feel, especially minority communities, feel that they have this need to not confirm stereotypes about them. And so that was something that I had to really struggle with writing A Woman Is No Man. Is I was writing about this community that was already stereotyped against, a community that had a really bad rep in the media. So to talk about the dark aspects of the culture, I knew that people in my community were not going to be very receptive to the novel. We're not going to be very receptive to talking about these dark issues. But fortunately, there was a lot of great response, good positive response from the community, from women who felt that for once they found their stories in the pages of literature. They could see their mothers in these characters, they could see their sisters, and the shame of gender violence no longer felt like something you couldn't talk about or have a conversation with. I had lots of messages from women who told me that the novel really opened up conversations in the community. Women who told me that they were going to make the novel a required reading for their daughters. And it just really showed me that sometimes, while we're aware of certain issues, it's really hard to start conversations, and we really need research, or we need fiction. We need a place to start talking about these issues. And I feel like A Woman Is No Man gave these women a chance to really look inward and to talk about something that perhaps they were too ashamed to talk about before.
Thank you. I think the truth is that, as you're saying, fiction allows for complexity, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a position, which I think becomes really, really important in conversations around gender-based violence and so many other things. These are nuanced, complex issues. So amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kind of following along that line, I think there's been so much art and activism in South Africa. I'm wondering, are you finding it helpful in terms of kind of highlighting the big problem of gender-based violence in South Africa using your art? Yolanda.
I'm sorry. Oh, Yolanda. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Did you hear my question? I think we have a delay. Yolanda, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi there. I'm here. My internet is a bit unstable, but I hope it'll carry me through. Sorry, can I get your question again, please?
Sure. How have you seen art and activism really kind of move the issue or highlight the issue of gender-based violence in South Africa? How has it helped?
Right. Yeah, I think I'd just like to speak from my personal experience, I think which is also what kind of drives my work, what my work is centered on, and just reflecting on my journey as a survivor. I think how I've used and what kind of influenced me and got me to the position where I am today in terms of how I've chosen to advocate against gender-based violence is, I think in my introduction, I mentioned how I was a student activist, and a movement that I was particularly really involved in was a movement that erupted at the university still known as Rhodes. On the 17th of April in 2016, I was doing my second year as a student there. And this movement erupted on the university campus, which was led by the women students and members of the LGBTQI+ community. And it was a campaign that was really highlighting and bringing forward the issue of what we believed to be a perpetual rape culture crisis that we were experiencing as students. And we defined it as a culture, a rape culture. We defined it as rape culture because of the pervasiveness of this violence, and how it become so normal.
I think we have a delay for a second. Hopefully you'll come back. We're back to you, Etaf. Yolanda, you're back. Hello. You left off as it became so normal. I think you're frozen again. Yolanda? Okay, so let's move to Anna and come back to Yolanda. Oh, Yolanda, you're back. You left off at it had become so normal.
Yeah, and this violence had become so pervasive, and this, we had come to this realization. But what had sparked this movement, was a list of 11 names that had dropped on social media on one of the student pages, right, on that we used as students, and it didn't allude to anything. It didn't allege that these men were perpetrators of any form of sexual and gender-based violence. But the thing is, we had known, it was a reality. We had known who the perpetrators were, and that list on its own, moved and inspired the women on campus to mobilize and organize themselves under this banner called #RU_reference_list, making reference to this, the 11 men, plus the others that we know and didn't know of at the time. And we protested. It was like weeks. The protests lasted for weeks, and of course, for me, I was aware. I've always been aware of violence against women, but I hadn't understood it entirely until I gained a level of consciousness through being a student, learning, and coming across a number of social, political, and economic ideologies that explained and brought to light, these issues to me. Apart from the fact that I'd also been raped in my first year as a student, which also propelled me towards my activism and wanting to fight back and fight for justice. So I think that's also how I'm trying to link how I got then introduced and familiarized with the concept of feminism and why I identify as a radical feminist. But in any case, also then, that also then influenced my perspective on my activism and life. And with the environment that the university had also created, I feel and felt at the time, where we were just really exposed to this violence. That movement, for me, I took as for me, it was my moment of breaking my silence, for me to be able to actually speak up and speak out and rise up, I guess, against what I was experiencing as a student, as a woman student on campus. And when we did this, one of the interesting modes of protesting, I think, that we used was on the 19th of April 2016, was a Tuesday. We embarked on a naked protest where we literally bared our naked bodies on the line. We used our bodies as symbolic sites of power and freedom, I'd like to describe, against the perpetrators, against the system of patriarchy and gender-based violence. A system which continues to see our bodies as sites of violence for despicable actions to be, I guess, done on whatever. And that whole protest for me really, I believe, used a lot of artistic methods, including singing, the placards that we held and the posters that we, held when we protested on the streets. But for me, it was just reflecting on the naked protest, really, how that made me feel. It made me feel in control, the uncomfortability that it also caused to the men, for the men, to the university was very symbolic for me. And this protest caused an international uproar, with obviously inspiring different views to be shared on social media, which also highlighted, I guess, the different influences that people, or views that people have when it comes to gender-based violence, and just the idea of what power means, and the whole idea of just reclaiming our power as women. So, sorry, I'm just a bit nervous. I'm just trying to go through my notes. But this movement for me, I reflect on this movement and this particular protest, the naked protest, because we relied a whole lot on performative functions to interrogate and deal with the violence that we're experiencing. And of course, protests in South Africa, as I said earlier on, do rely on a lot of artistic elements, such as singing during the protest, the use of the placards.
I think we lost you again. Let's give it a second. Okay, let's wait. We'll come back. Amazing. And I will say, just having worked with women with HIV in South Africa from the early years, really powerful.
Hi, I'm back. I'm sorry about that.
No,
just
it's
to kind
fine.
of conclude, really, if the time still allows, Terry, I'm not too sure. It's just kind of to say and share with you guys how I then link my experience of student activism and being part of this movement, the RE references movement, and the naked protest, and all the other artistic elements that we explored throughout that protest. And with the work that I'm doing right now with my organization, is I'm really interested in storytelling and the sharing of experiences, and using that as a form of advocacy and to raise awareness. Of course, I don't have any prescriptive methods of how we can really solely, there are prescriptive methods, but I personally do not want to put myself in that position. I believe our experiences are just as important. There are simple methods that we can use that are just as powerful in portraying and putting across the message.
Okay. All right. Let's when Yolanda returns, she can just finish her thoughts, but let's move momentarily to Anna. So, we know how skeptical many governments are of addressing and including gender-based violence in international agreements. We know that despite all that we know and all of the documentation, it's just like when the conversation happens, it's left out. Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to advocate and pressure the governments to include it? And Yolanda, we're going to come back to you. Welcome back. Anna.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's interesting reflecting over the last 10 years how attitudes have shifted in the international community, I would say, towards concepts of gender and gender-based violence. I recall, very clearly when we started working on this specific language in 2010, and I was on a panel at the UN with some women ambassadors and senior UN officials, and we began talking about the concept of the gendered impact of armed violence and so on. And a male diplomat in the audience, who's one of the first when we got to question and answers, literally said, I realize this is a very emotional issue for those of you on the panel, but you need to understand it's got no place in international security and disarmament. And just completely, rejecting the idea that we could even discuss such a concept. And I think the fact that international arms control and disarmament was such a male-dominated issue, and Forum for so many years at the UN was a significant factor in that. It's got better in recent years, but still in the last analysis that the UN did, 70% of delegations in arms control and disarmament fora are male-headed. And that certainly, I think, has an impact on the way that the dialogues go. But we've seen a shift from that attitude of sort of open confrontation, and often in other instances, we were literally laughed out of the door by legal advisors when we dared to suggest that gender could appear in a treaty in this way, to now it being unacceptable to not have a position on GBV. And I think, although a decade is a long time, and it often seems like 2 steps forward and 1 step back, particularly if we look at the politics in this country, say over the last few years, we can see that very well illustrated. But I would say that overall there's been progress. And one of the ways that we managed to break through this was by working together, civil society and smaller governments. So we initially began on the Arms Trade Treaty working with the governments of Iceland, a very small country on the international stage, but the only one at the time that explicitly had a feminist foreign policy declared, and Trinidad and Tobago, whose Prime Minister was very outspoken and active about the issue of gender-based violence within her own country, and saw clearly the link between arms flooding into the island and gender-based violence increasing. So with those 2 governments to start with, we gradually reached out to more and more smaller, more progressive governments, and got support for on things like statements within the UN negotiations. And a significant moment that we reached was when we got 100 governments signing on to a statement calling for language on GBV in the treaty. And that was significant at 100 because it was more than 50% of the UN members. So you reach a kind of tipping point like that, and then the snowball starts to roll. So beginning with the smaller countries, and then gradually building up, we saw the bigger countries gradually coming on board until the overwhelming majority agreed and supported the inclusion of such language, and it became enshrined. It doesn't mean that we've completely transformed attitudes, obviously, but I do think we were significantly changed the terms of the debate, and we've shifted gender from being seen as something that was completely marginal within armed violence and conflict discussions to something which is now seen as a very important central topic and theme.
Thank you. Interestingly, all of you are talking about overcoming silence in different contexts, and it's absolutely critical, and kind of we're talking about different ways to do that. Let me turn to you, Nikki. You talked about the interviews that you did around COVID-19 and service providers in South Africa. What surprised you from the research? How could research help with gender-based violence, and also any comments you have on kind of art and activism in that context?
Okay. So, it was the biggest surprise for me, and actually for service providers, in the way that the response was panned out, was that, South Africa had been through various stages. We had, as Yolanda mentioned, some protests done, all the time, particularly the roads one, 2016. And then we look at the total shutdown movement that happened in 2018. And then this culminated in also getting the GBV and femicide national strategic plan in place. But then when it came to the response for the pandemic, there was no guidance at all in terms of what to do with gender-based violence service provision. And this was a big surprise, and many service providers were actually not happy with this. And also one other thing that was very surprising is that the country does not even have a comprehensive national disaster management plan for pandemics. When you look at it, the social aspects, the economic aspects, the health aspects, it impacts a lot, on people. And particularly when you look at the food issues, where food parcels had to be handed out in the communities. And then the other thing that really surprised us, was that, we are here, big NGOs come in, help support, your communities. But at the end of the day, the community-based organizations are the front line for responses. And they were not resilient enough to cope during that time. And they were incapacitated. And it was a really terrible time in that people had to now move around, rush around, and do a lot of things to try and make sure things happen. But again, in the Ubuntu style of things in South Africa, this oneness that we always have here, you'll see that people really put down their differences. They just decided to work together and come up with comprehensive packages of how to assist women, particularly during the pandemic. Innovative strategies had to be put in place because women were being violated at that time. And I think another, surprise, though more pleasant, was that, the president announced publicly that GBV was an issue and that it was an emergency. It had to have resources put towards it. And resources have been put towards it, although our service providers and even myself are quite skeptical if all those resources will come to, because of the corruption that is in the country, particularly when you look at what happened with corruption during this phase, the pandemic and the PPE and everything, what has panned out. So, those were the surprises we got. And in terms of how research can bring light to gender-based violence, Yolanda mentioned issues of, we have to protest. Etaf also mentioned issues that, there is shame in gender-based violence. Women don't talk about this. And also, Anna also talked about, people not wanting to come face to face and confront these issues. So with research can easily bring out all these nuances. Research can bring out these issues, these silenced norms, what people call norms in their homes, what people have accepted as the cultural norms. These have to be brought out and injustices have to be unearthed. And research is a way of doing this. And research is also a way to advocate, for change of laws. And we want also change of policies, particularly in our governments. We need to have this done. And an example is, of course, the total shutdown protest. That's what happened, and data started coming out. Unfortunately, in our countries, the data is not that great. Routine data does not capture everything. Women do not report. So the only way we can actually do this to show what is there and advocate is to do the research, And when you look at the research, the quantitative side of things will bring out the numbers, the different forms, how many, where, what, how, and to highlight the hotspots and where interventions should be put in place. But the qualitative side of things should not be underestimated also, because it brings the voices, it brings the social and cultural context to what women are going through in their homes, with all this violence that is going around. And I believe, using both these strategies and also using your art, using what can relate to people contextualized, it will actually help in mapping out evidence-based strategies for us to actually support women who experience a lot of gender-based violence. And of course, again, this has to be contextual and it has to relate to the people that you're going to do your interventions in. So I think it is critically important that we merge that research and the arts and any other forms of trying to make all these things aware, people aware, particularly men, to see how we can also prevent gender-based violence in our communities.
Thank you so much. Let me make sure. Yeah, I remember fairly early on in the HIV epidemic, women gathering in Namibia in front of a clinic where they were sterilizing women without their consent and singing. And then that brought all these researchers and all kinds of folks to begin to look at this. So I feel like you see this complex interplay all the time in the most successful strategies. So I want to give our audience a chance to ask some questions. So we have a question for Yolanda from Griselda, who is a survivor of human trafficking. She wants to know, Yolanda, what you think about the National Strategic Plan that has been drafted for gender-based violence. Are you with us, Yolanda? Okay, I'm not sure. We may have lost her. So let's come back. Let me have a look at some. So a question we have is, how interested are people in arts-based prevention strategies? This person has developed a program starting in Brazil to engage men in arts, sports to combat boredom, which is this person says is a trigger for domestic violence and has not been addressed. So how interested are people in arts-based prevention strategies? Do you think? That's to the panel. I guess another way to ask that question is, do you think we should be using arts more in our work, our outreach to boys and men around gender-based violence? Clearly, whatever we are using has not been working well enough. I was very interested to see what was being targeted to men and boys once we had all these stay-at-home orders, whether there were public service announcements. So any thoughts on kind of the use of arts for preventive strategies, particularly targeting men and boys? Anyone?
I guess I'd say, I mean, just in terms of targeting men and boys, I think that's absolutely essential. And certainly in trying to advocate on the international stage, I've had sort of years of experience of speaking at, on panels and at side events where the audience is, say, 90% women. And it can be incredibly frustrating to be talking about gender issues, which clearly by definition affects the spectrum of genders, and yet only women would be in the audience. Again, I think that is starting to change, and it's positive that that's starting to change, and more men are becoming actively involved in those discussions, because we need them to be so, and we need issues such as gender-based violence to not be seen as issues for women to solve and issues for women to discuss, but issues for all of us to address. And the role of masculinity and masculine identities within that is absolutely essential to address. So maybe initiatives like the UN's like He for She campaign, for example, a couple of years ago, is an interesting example of institutions trying specifically to reach out to men and boys. But I mean, yes, I think we definitely need to increase the ways that we engage with all genders.
Great, thank you. I see there's a question for Nikki. Thinking about the research you did, do you see potential ways to engage communities using arts?
Yes, there's quite a lot of potential for using art, and particularly with prevention. And I think that's where Yolanda is coming to also, in terms of how to respond in South Africa, and a lot of art, and also even just, roping in music into all these issues has actually helped, and is being on the forefront by a lot of service providers to say, we need to make particularly men listen. We need to have you be on the forefront again in terms of trying to prevent gender-based violence, and to understand what gender-based violence is. So I think we need really to keep pushing in terms of pulling into all those ways, innovative ways in which we can try and get people to understand and see, especially in our cultures, our African cultural settings, where, people can, it's not a matter of just sitting down and talking to me. You have to come in with contextual ways of doing it for me to get it and to understand what's needed for me to help in these initiatives.
Thank you. Etaf, I'm wondering, given the incredibly rich kind of arts history of Palestinians, Palestine, do you see more potential for arts-based strategies in terms of preventing gender-based violence, based on your experience with, the community's reaction and the women's reaction to your book?
Absolutely. I think arts provides a way to take what we've learned through research and contextualize it within communities without creating a sort of defense mechanisms. I mean, I can see the Palestinian culture being very similar to, South African culture in that need to, the shame and the need to like cover up and secrecy when it comes to gender-based violence, even in communities where it's very obvious, in homes where it's very obvious that there is gender-based violence against women, it sort of becomes the norm and is not spoken of, or is it's dismissed. And so finding a way to express that, to talk about it through arts, whether it's through poetry, music, whether it's through, reading literature and having discussion about these topics in a way that is not so personal, I think helps teach people to communicate and not just repress all of these emotions and all of the shame that comes, and also the trauma that we are passing down to our children. A lot of the work that I do focuses on intergenerational trauma, and specifically in the novel, it's about 3 generations of women who come from this very strict culture of normalizing violence, and how that is stored in our body and then passed down from one generation to the next. And so if there's a way that we can start talking about these issues, and not just with our daughters, but with our sons as well, then I think that would be very helpful, just to start the conversation and see how we can heal, and how we can ask our service providers to be very aware of the cultural complexities of violence. When there are not many resources available for cultural violence, because I think that's very different than white violence. And I think also understanding those complexities as well can really help us address these issues.
So I feel like your novel is also about resilience and survival. Say a bit more about how what you're describing actually, in a sense, kind of teaches resilience and survival.
Yeah, I mean, especially since, the title of the novel is A Woman Is No Man. And originally when I started writing it, it was about all the patriarchal gender norms of women, and how in very conservative Palestinian communities, a woman was subjected to violence and treated very inferiorly to men. But then it also became a way in which women are so much more resilient, and in which women have the power to really change the narrative. Women have the power to teach their children, both their girls and their boys, how to empower themselves, how to respect women. They set the standards, whether they consciously or unconsciously pass down the trauma, or whether they choose to teach different ways. And I think that's what this panel is about. It's using research and art and to change the narrative, and to really speak about the narrative in order to be able to change it.
Yes, thank you. That's I wanted to, I don't know if Yolanda's back. I did want to give her a chance if she's back, but I can't tell. Yolanda, I don't see a, so okay, let's switch back. Anna, you were describing an incredibly kind of male, I'm sure also white supremacist kind of context to be introducing, to be really talking about gender-based violence. So that's an environment where you're told this is not what we're talking about. This is a non-issue. And of course, many of us are in those environments all the time. Any words on kind of, for, we have so many students who ask questions about, I'm in these contexts, how do I enter the conversation with my own identity and my own experience and not lose all my power? Any thoughts on how you were able to kind of respond in the way that you did, and what are some of the strategies?
Well, I think absolutely working together with others is critical. If you feel isolated and attacked and marginalized in your position, it can be very difficult to assert yourself, even if your arguments are right and your evidence is there. So I think, for us, working in a coalition with women's organizations from around the world, as well as many international civil society organizations, was key. And I do think that the link between arts and policy is fundamental, actually. Arts and stories is how we identify and frame our gender identities. And it is no coincidence that heavily male-dominated environments that are discussing international security are employing a definition of masculinity, an approach and definition of strength, which is very toxic. It's based on having lots of weaponry makes you strong at the most simplistic level, and that's very dangerous. There's countless evidence to demonstrate that involving women in peace building, involving women in negotiations, for example, leads to much more sustainable peace. And Resolution 1325 at the UN, back from years back, is exactly about rooting women centrally in peace building and conflict prevention methods because of recognizing that. And I think we need to, see the arts as an essential part of how we reframe a patriarchal definition of peace, perhaps, which is often too much based upon aggressive notions of military might and military strength, and look more at how engagement, interaction, dialogue, sustainable peace building efforts can be so much more essential to be able to address many of the challenges that we're facing in the world today. And I think that arts and storytelling are an essential part of that. So I really welcome this discussion, and I think there's many more ways that we could continue discussing amongst ourselves and with the audience about how we can build on those linkages between the arts, between activism, and between policy making.
I think that's really, really important. I think I do want to give you all a chance at the end to talk to the audience about how they can be involved. I did want to share that after years of working with women with HIV, I left, and shortly thereafter, my mother was killed in 9/11. And that was the most outrageously horrible experience, largely because I was working with all these women who were Muslim, whose husbands were killed, who couldn't have relatives visit them, who were being harassed on the streets. The context was, God bless America. There was no way into it. It was all too simplified. So I actually did a ton of interviews and wrote a play. So I think the reason I was asked to do this panel is because I really do understand all too well that kind of the polarized discussions that go on leave out much of what's really happening, and often leaves out what will actually change people's hearts and minds. So I believe very strongly, even having been a human rights lawyer all my life, that we can't, all of these pieces have to be woven together, or we're not going to be able to shift anything. And that, the answer lies in complexity and acknowledging the differences that you all are discussing. So I think this is, congratulations to the organizers, because I think this is a very powerful and important panel. So we only have like 6 minutes left. I think if each of you could say a few things about maybe how audience members could connect, how we might do more along these lines to prevent gender-based violence. And I'm really hoping Yolanda's back with us, but at least we got to hear some about her amazing work. So is it okay if I start with you, Nikki?
Yeah, so I'm a researcher, and I believe that, the more we research, the more we get, innovative ways of doing things, particularly for gender-based violence prevention, and centering it around getting the narrative heard by the men. I think that's what's important. And also just to hear them out, what is going on with the men, particularly here in South Africa. There have been quite a lot of initiatives in the communities for men. So I think that is very important for me to try and understand what is going on, and we haven't had any answers. We do have a few answers, but we need more answers. That's what I need just to put out there. We need more answers, and we can get this by research. I started my own organization, and it's called Research Link Me. So you can also reach out to me, and we can see how we can also push the agenda for research so that we can push also, strategies for service providers to also implement in the communities for prevention, for extraction services, for health, clinical services, for gender-based violence, and every other aspect for gender-based violence. I'm very passionate about it.
Thank you. Anna, how about you in the context that you work? Thoughts on how people can be involved and maybe some ways forward?
I guess as an activist, I'm always keen to encourage people to get involved with campaigns, whether that be in your local environment, in your school, your workplace, your community, or whether it be joining an international or nationally based campaign. I think by working together and continuously challenging the structures and beliefs that are perpetuating this sort of violent, toxic masculinity around GBV is going to be the way that we gradually change beliefs as well as change policies. I also think that, just even if that's down to the level of like sharing stories is really important. I agree with what Etaf was saying earlier about how people can often find engaging with fiction less threatening and perhaps more transformative in challenging their own beliefs than being faced with, say, a documentary or a factual report to read. So I would very much encourage the sharing of such stories that are helping to reframe our definitions and approaches. And I think most of all, get involved in some way, reach out, attend, go and see plays that are challenging, engaging with these concepts, go to an art exhibition, get involved in more panels like this, join a group, read more books. Most of all, just get involved.
Thank you so much. Etaf. You're muted. You're muted. Oh, maybe you're frozen.
Got it. Very similar to what Nikki and Anna have all shared some great remarks. As an artist, I do believe that it's my responsibility to take, the research and, to pay attention to our world politics, to the activism that's going on, and to use that to inspire the stories that I choose to tell and put into the world, and to be as authentic as possible. I know that it's not just about sharing stories about women, but it's also, like Nikki said, trying to understand the mindset of our men. What has informed their decision process? What sort of traumas have they faced to have them, put about all this the toxicity that they are into their family. So I feel like it's my responsibility to approach my art as a researcher, if that makes sense, and to try to educate readers by telling the narrative and the stories of survivors, of non-survivors, of community members, in a way where people have access to these stories and to other diverse stories from communities that they don't have necessarily access to. So I really do believe it's important for us to read more, to have access to diverse communities and see things that are not part of our normal routine, to make it to make sure that we go out of our way to educate ourselves about other communities, so that we're able to see the signs, we're able to offer our help, and we're able to change the narrative in our own families, for my own kids, to make sure that they're well aware of the world that they live in and of the signs, if that makes sense. So I'm really happy that I'm part of this panel, because I feel like research, activism, and art, they all are hand in hand into changing the way that we see gender-based violence.
Thank you so much. I don't think, is Yolanda back? Basically, I think Yolanda, unfortunately, is not able to rejoin us, but I guess in closing, I just want to say, I think that what you all were able to do is show kind of the courage, resilience, beauty in how people survive the unimaginable. And that unlocks so much for the audience who are also experiencing different versions of that. So thank you all so much. And it has truly been an honor to moderate and meet all of you. So thank you. And
thank you for having us.
Thank you, audience.